Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Arthur Vance laughed as he dropped the heavy blue leather binder onto the mahogany table, intentionally splashing dregs of cold coffee onto Elena's hand-drawn blueprints. The liquid bloomed like a dark bruise across the intricate sketches of the museum wing she had spent 6 months designing. "You really shouldn't leave your little hobby projects in the library, Elena," Arthur said, his voice booming with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no. He didn't look at the damage he'd caused. Instead, he adjusted the heavy gold signet ring on his pinky finger, catching the afternoon light. "We have actual business to discuss with Marcus, and this table is for adults." Elena Vance didn't flinch, though her pulse thrummed against her throat. She looked at her ruined work, then up at her father. Beside him, Beatrice Vance sat perched on a velvet armchair, delicately adjusting her pearls. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She simply smoothed the silk of her designer skirt, her eyes fixed on the garden outside as if her daughter's humiliation were merely a dull television program. "It wasn't a hobby, Dad," Elena said, her voice remarkably level. "That's the final proposal for the Holloway project. The deadline is tomorrow." Julian Vance, leaning against the fireplace mantel with a glass of scotch despite it being only 3 in the afternoon, let out a sharp, mocking snort. "The Holloway project? Elena, let's be real. You only got that interview because of the Vance name. You were always playing at being an architect while I was actually learning how to run the firm." "Is that what you call it, Julian?" Elena asked, turning her gaze toward her brother. "I thought you were learning how to spend the company's travel budget in Saint-Tropez." Arthur's hand slammed onto the blue binder, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent library. The smell of stale cigar smoke and Beatrice's cloying jasmine perfume seemed to tighten around Elena like a noose. "That's enough," Arthur snapped. "Marcus is here to finalize the restructuring of the family trust. Since you've decided to waste your life drawing buildings that will never be built, I've decided to simplify things. Your mother's legacy fund is being rolled into the primary estate. It's for the best. You clearly don't have the head for management." Marcus Hallowell, the family's longtime lawyer, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He opened his briefcase, his eyes darting toward Elena for a fraction of a second before dropping to the floor. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps just a crime he was being paid to ignore. "The restructuring?" Elena's voice was a whisper now, but it carried a sharp edge. "My mother's trust was meant to be mine on my 30th birthday. That's less than a month away." Arthur leaned forward, his shadow falling over her. "And as your father, I've determined you aren't ready. You're impulsive, you're flighty, you're a girl who thinks she's a professional. The funds have already been moved. I've signed the papers as the primary executor. Julian will be taking over the board seat that came with those shares." Beatrice finally spoke, her voice like honey poured over glass. "It's for your own protection, darling. You've always been so sensitive. Money like that is a burden you aren't equipped to carry." Elena felt the familiar heat of rage rising, but she forced it down, burying it deep under a layer of ice. She looked at the blue leather binder under her father's hand. It wasn't just a folder. It was the ledger of her mother's life, the record of the wealth Arthur had been systematically draining for years to cover Julian's gambling debts and his own failing investments. She noticed the way Marcus's fingers trembled as he handed Arthur a fountain pen. The lawyer knew. He knew exactly what Arthur was doing was illegal, but he was tethered to the Vance payroll. "I see," Elena said. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She didn't reach for her ruined blueprints. She didn't beg. She simply smoothed her modest wool blazer, her hand brushing against the small, cold weight of the digital recorder she had activated the moment she entered the room. "You're taking it well for once," Julian mocked, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Maybe there's hope for you yet, sis. You can always come work as my receptionist once I'm CEO." Arthur chuckled, a deep, guttural sound of victory. He began to scrawl his signature across the documents inside the blue binder, the ink bleeding into the expensive parchment. "Go on then, Elena. Don't you have a little drawing to go cry over?" Elena walked toward the door, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. She stopped at the threshold and turned back. Arthur didn't look up, already deep in conversation with Marcus about the next phase of his restructuring. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Mrs. Gable, the family's former accountant who had been retired 6 months ago. The older woman was carrying a stack of fresh linens, her face a mask of weary subservience. But as Elena passed, Mrs. Gable's hand darted out, catching Elena's wrist for a fleeting second. "The basement archives," the old woman whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost to the hum of the air conditioning. "The 2018 audit. He missed a page in the blue ledger, the real one." Elena felt a jolt of electricity shoot through her. She nodded once, a sharp, imperceptible movement. She walked out of the manor and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight of the driveway. She looked back at the towering stone facade of the Vance estate, a monument to greed and stolen legacies. Her father thought he had just closed the door on her future. He thought he had successfully erased her mother's wishes with a stroke of a pen. He had no idea that Elena had been paying attention for 29 years. She knew the sound of his lies. She knew the smell of his desperation. And now, she knew exactly where he had hidden the knife he'd used to stab her in the back. Elena pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number she had committed to memory weeks ago. "Marcus is compromised," she said into the receiver, her voice cold and steady as she watched her father's shadow move across the library window. "Start the forensic audit on the primary estate, and call the Halloways. Tell them I'll be late for the meeting, but I'm bringing them something much more interesting than a museum design." She climbed into her car, the engine turning over with a low, predatory growl. The countdown had begun. Arthur Vance wanted to play at being a king. Fine. She was more than happy to show him what happened when a kingdom was built on sand. 2 weeks. That was all she needed. 2 weeks until her 30th birthday, and 2 weeks until the world found out exactly what was hidden inside the blue leather binder. The next morning, the sterile hush of Hallowell and Associates felt like a shroud. Elena stepped through the glass doors at exactly 8 o'clock, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum that contradicted the chaos she intended to unleash. The lobby smelled of expensive floor wax and the bitter, over-roasted espresso favored by people who valued status over taste. She didn't pause at the reception desk. She knew exactly where the vultures were circling. In the primary boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of Arthur's cloying, sandalwood cologne, a fragrance that had once represented safety but now triggered a visceral spike of nausea. He sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, looking every bit the patriarch he pretended to be. Beside him, Julian was leaning back in his chair, lazily checking his gold Rolex. Marcus Hallowell stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders hunched in a way that screamed of a guilty conscience. "You're late," Arthur said, not looking up from the blueprint spread before him. "But I suppose punctuality is a luxury for those who actually contribute to the firm's bottom line." Elena didn't flinch. She pulled out a chair and sat, the leather creaking under her weight. "The meeting was set for 8. It is 8. Perhaps your watch is running as fast as your imagination, Arthur." Julian let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. "Still got that bite, El. It's a shame it doesn't translate into talent. Dad and I were just reviewing the museum project. We've decided to move in a more sophisticated direction. My direction." Lena looked at the drawings. They were hers, every line, every cantilevered wing, every innovative use of natural light. But her name had been scrubbed from the title block, replaced by Julian's blocky, unearned signature. This was the second theft. First her inheritance, now her legacy. "Julian couldn't design a birdhouse without a manual," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. "Watch your mouth," Arthur snapped, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were cold, devoid of any fatherly warmth. "Julian is the future of the Vance name. You're just the labor. We've already told the board that these designs were his brainchild. You're here to handle the mundane technical specs, the plumbing, the wiring, the things that don't require vision." Marcus finally turned around, his face pale. "Elena, it's for the best. The investors want a stable lead. Julian provides the image they're looking for. Elena felt the weight of the blue leather binder in her bag, the edges of the documents inside sharp and ready. She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing the cool metal of her phone, which was already recording. She didn't reveal her hand yet. Instead, she leaned forward, her shadow stretching across the stolen blueprints. "The Halloways are coming in this afternoon for the final walkthrough," she said. "Are you sure you want Julian to lead that presentation?" "He still thinks a load-bearing wall is a suggestion," Julian sneered, adjusting his silk tie. "I'll charm them, Elle, something you've never been able to do with that perpetual scowl. Besides, Mom is already planning the celebration gala. It's set for your 30th birthday, 2 weeks from now. It'll be the perfect stage to announce my appointment as senior partner." The rage spiked in Elena's chest, hot and bright. Beatrice Vance was already moving ahead with the social theater, likely using the very funds Arthur had embezzled from Elena's trust to pay for the champagne and the caviar. They were planning to celebrate her brother's theft on the day she was supposed to come into her own. "A gala," Elena repeated, a small, sharp smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "How fitting. A grand stage for a grand performance." Arthur stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "The matter is settled. You will provide Julian with the structural calculations by noon. Don't make me regret keeping you on the payroll, Elena. You're only here because your mother insists on maintaining the appearance of a unified family." He walked toward the door, Julian trailing behind him like a loyal, pampered dog. As they passed her, Julian leaned in, his voice a low hiss. "Don't worry, sis, I'll make sure to mention you in the footnotes of the program, somewhere near the caterers." They left the room, their laughter echoing in the hallway. Marcus stayed behind, unable to look her in the eye. "You should have fought harder for me, Marcus," she said softly. "I have a firm to protect, Elena," he whispered. "So do I," she replied. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "And I have 2 weeks to make sure there's nothing left of yours to protect." She walked out of the boardroom, her mind already on the forensic auditor's first report. The Halloways wouldn't be meeting with a consultant this afternoon. They would be meeting with the woman who held the keys to the Vance Empire's destruction. As she reached the lobby, she checked her phone. The recording was crystal clear. Every insult, every admission of the stolen design, every arrogant boast. The countdown wasn't just for her birthday anymore. It was for the funeral of her father's reputation. She stepped out into the sunlight, the heat of the city pressing against her, and felt a cold, predatory satisfaction. The gala was in 14 days. 14 days until the music stopped. 2 days later, the morning fog clung to the windows of the greasy Spoon Diner like a shroud, blurring the world outside into shades of slate and charcoal. Elena Vance sat in the back booth, the vinyl seat cracking beneath her, as she watched the steam rise from a chipped ceramic mug. The scent of burnt coffee and old grease filled the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, sandalwood-scented hallways of her father's penthouse. She wasn't alone. Across from her, Mrs. Gable sat with her coat still buttoned to her chin, her fingers trembling as she clutched a leather-bound ledger. The older woman had been the Vance family's accountant for 30 years, a ghost in the machinery who had seen every dollar that entered and exited their lives. "I shouldn't be giving you this," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the refrigerator. "If your father finds out I kept a duplicate set of books, he'll ruin me. He has ways of making people disappear from the industry." "He's already ruined me, Margaret," Elena said, her voice steady and cold. "He didn't just take my firm. He took the trust my mother left for me. He treated my inheritance like his personal slush fund." Mrs. Gable slid the ledger across the table. Her eyes were wide with a mix of guilt and terror. "It's worse than you think. Arthur Vance didn't just borrow the money to cover the firm's losses. He used your trust to pay off the gambling debts Julian racked up in Macau last year. And when that wasn't enough, he forged your signature on a series of high-interest loans. The bank doesn't see him as the debtor, Elena. They see you." Elena felt a sharp, electric jolt of rage. She flipped open the ledger, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers. There it was, the signature, a perfect imitation of her own hand, dated 3 days after her mother's funeral. While she had been draped in black, grieving the only person who had ever truly loved her, her father had been in his study, practicing how to steal her future. "Thank you," she said, her fingers grazing the cold, smooth surface of a USB drive tucked inside the ledger's spine. "This is everything I need." "What are you going to do?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice shaking. Elena looked up, her gaze pinning the accountant to her seat. "I'm going to give him exactly what he's earned." By late afternoon, the fog had burned off, replaced by a biting wind that swept through the manicured gardens of the Vance estate. Elena stepped out of her modest sedan, the gravel crunching under her boots. She hadn't come to argue. She had come to collect the last of her personal files. But as she reached the front mahogany doors, the roar of a high-performance engine cut through the silence. A brand-new, cherry-red Italian sports car slid into the driveway, its polished chrome gleaming in the dying sunlight. The door swung upward, and Arthur Vance stepped out, looking every bit the conquering king in a bespoke charcoal suit. He adjusted his gold signet ring, the heavy metal catching the light as he smirked at his daughter. "Still driving that pathetic little box, I see," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing warmth that made Elena's skin crawl. "I told you, Elena. If you just stayed in your place, I might have bought you something decent for your birthday. Instead, you threw a tantrum and walked away from the only thing that gave you value." "Value is a funny thing, Father," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. "It can vanish overnight if you aren't careful." He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Is that a threat from you? You're a Vance in name only now. I've already contacted the board. Your designs have been legally reattributed to the firm. You have nothing. No name, no money, and certainly no future in this city." Beatrice Vance appeared in the doorway, draped in a cream pashmina that cost more than Elena's first year of tuition. She didn't look at her daughter. Her eyes were fixed on the car. "Arthur, is this the one? It's divine. It will look perfect in the photos for the gala." "The best money can buy," he boasted, patting the hood of the car. He turned back to Elena, his expression hardening. "I'm giving your childhood bedroom to Julian's new lead consultant. Marcus needs a place to stay while we finalize the merger. I suggest you get your things and leave before I have security escort you off the property." The rage in Elena's chest crystallized into a sharp, predatory focus. She looked at the car, then at the man who had traded his daughter's life for a set of leather seats and a faster engine. She could feel the weight of the USB drive in her pocket, the digital record of every forged signature, every embezzled cent, and every lie he had told the IRS. "You really shouldn't have bought the car, Arthur," she said softly. He narrowed his eyes, his arrogance momentarily flickering into confusion. "And why is that?" "Because it's a very loud way to announce that you're spending money you don't actually have," she said. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "I hope you enjoy the leather smell while it lasts. 12 days, Father. In 12 days, the music stops." He went to grab her arm, his face flushing a deep, angry purple, but she stepped back with a fluid grace. She didn't wait for his retort. She turned and walked toward her car, her heart beating with a rhythmic, vengeful precision. As she pulled away from the gates, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Arthur was standing in the driveway, shouting something she couldn't hear, his expensive suit looking small against the backdrop of the house he had built on a foundation of theft. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she had memorized years ago. "This is Elena Vance," she said when the line picked up. "I have the forensic audit ready. I want the subpoenas served on the morning of the gala, not a minute sooner." She hung up and gripped the steering wheel, a cold smile touching her lips. The preparation was over. The trap was set. Now all she had to do was wait for him to walk into it. The day before the Vance Foundation gala, the air in the family estate tasted of forced celebration and cloying lilies. Elena Vance stood in the doorway of the Mahogany Road Library, watching her father. Arthur Vance was hunched over a scale model of the Vance Heights development, a glass of 20-year-old scotch glinting in his hand. The amber liquid caught the light, casting jagged shadows across the miniature buildings, designs that Elena had spent 3 years of her life perfecting, only for him to scrub her name from the blueprints and replace it with his own. "It's a masterpiece," Arthur murmured, his voice thick with self-congratulation. He didn't look up as she entered. "The city won't just remember the Vance name after tomorrow, Elena. They'll worship it. I've secured the final round of funding. We break ground on Monday." Elena felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, a cold, hard rectangle of plastic that held the digital trail of every cent he had siphoned from her trust to pay off his gambling debts and failed offshore ventures. She stepped further into the room, her heels silent on the thick Persian rug. "You should be careful with foundations built on borrowed time, Father," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "Sometimes the most beautiful structures are the ones hiding the deepest cracks." Arthur finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing behind his designer frames. He gave a sharp, dismissive bark of laughter. "Still playing the philosopher. That's the problem with you, Elena. You have the talent, but you lack the stomach for the heights. You should be thanking me. Without my intervention, you'd be just another struggling architect with a dream. Tomorrow night, you'll stand on that stage with me and smile because you're a Vance, and Vances don't fail." He turned back to his model, adjusting a miniature tree with the casual arrogance of a god. The scent of his expensive cigar smoke drifted toward her, a smell she had once associated with safety, but now only smelled like rot. "I won't be smiling for the reasons you think," she replied. "Just make sure the dress Beatrice picked for you fits," he snapped, not bothering to look up again. "I won't have you looking like a charity case in front of the Hallowells. Marcus Hallowell is bringing the lead investors. If you embarrass me tomorrow, I'll make sure you never work in the city again." Elena didn't argue. She didn't need to. The rage that had burned white-hot for weeks had cooled into something far more dangerous, precision. She turned to leave and nearly collided with Julian Vance. Her brother was leaning against the doorframe, his expression uncharacteristically somber as he watched the exchange. He followed her into the hallway, catching her arm gently. "Elena, wait. You're different lately. The way you're looking at him, it's like you're looking through him." "I'm just seeing him clearly for the first time, Julian," she said, her gaze meeting his. Julian glanced back at the library, then at his sister. For a moment, the usual spoiled smirk was absent from his face. "He's talking about the gala like it's a coronation. But Marcus Hallowell called me this morning. He was asking strange questions about the audit from 3 years ago, the one Mrs. Gable handled before she retired." Elena felt a surge of adrenaline, but kept her expression neutral. Mrs. Gable always was thorough. Maybe Marcus is just doing his due diligence. "Elena," Julian whispered, his voice tinged with a sudden, sharp anxiety. "Whatever you're doing, don't burn the whole house down with us inside it." "The house is already on fire, Julian," she said softly. "I'm just the one refusing to hide the matches anymore." She left him standing in the foyer and walked out to her car. An hour later, she sat in a dimly lit corner of a quiet park on the edge of the city. Mrs. Gable was already there, sitting on a bench with a manila envelope clutched in her liver-spotted hands. The former accountant looked smaller than Elena remembered, but her eyes were sharp with the kind of justice only a wronged woman can harbor. "The subpoenas were signed an hour ago, Elena," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of fear and satisfaction. "The process servers are briefed. They'll be at the gala entrance. The moment your father begins his keynote, they'll move in." Elena took the envelope, feeling the texture of the heavy paper. Inside were the physical copies of the forensic audit, the smoking gun that proved Arthur had committed felony embezzlement. "He thinks tomorrow is his greatest victory," Elena murmured, looking out at the city skyline where the Vance logo glowed atop a skyscraper. "He's forgotten that you're your mother's daughter," Mrs. Gable replied. "She was the one who actually built that company. He just put his name on the door." Elena nodded, a cold, calm smile finally touching her lips. She looked at the countdown on her phone, 24 hours. The day before the event was always the quietest, but as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, she knew the silence wouldn't last. Tomorrow, the music would stop, and Arthur Vance would finally have to pay the orchestra. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The trap was set. The warnings had been ignored. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the morning light. The evening of the Vance Foundation's annual gala arrived with a cloying, heavy heat that even the industrial-strength air conditioning of the museum wing couldn't quite suppress. The air inside the grand hall smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax, a scent Elena Vance had associated with her father's curated perfection since she was a child. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, her hand instinctively rising to the base of her throat. There, resting against her collarbone, was the sapphire pendant that had belonged to her mother. It was a heavy, cold weight, a piece of history that Arthur had tried to lock in a safety deposit box years ago, claiming it was too distracting for a young girl. Arthur Vance stood at the very center of the room, the undisputed son of his own private solar system. He was draped in a tuxedo that likely cost more than a mid-sized sedan, holding court with a group of city council members and high-level donors. His laughter, boisterous and calculated, rang out over the polite hum of the string quartet. He looked every bit the benevolent patriarch, the man who had built an empire on integrity and legacy. Elena watched him for a long moment, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum in her ears. She wasn't the trembling daughter who had walked out of his office 3 weeks ago. She felt the sharp edge of the flash drive tucked into the hidden pocket of her red silk clutch, a secret weapon that felt as potent as a loaded gun. "You look like you're planning a coup or a funeral," a voice murmured beside her. She turned to see Julian Vance. Her brother looked uncomfortable in his formal wear, his tie already slightly askew. Despite being the favored son, he had always lacked their father's appetite for the spotlight. "Maybe both," she replied, her voice calm. "Where's Beatrice?" Julian nodded toward the bar. "Holding court. She's already told 3 people that your dress is a bold choice for someone of your complexion." "That's her code for I hate it." "She's consistent, if nothing else," she said. She caught sight of Marcus Hallowell weaving through the crowd toward them. The family's longtime attorney looked harried, his brow damp with perspiration despite the cool air. "Elena," Marcus said, reaching them and offering a stiff nod. "I didn't think you'd make it tonight. Your father mentioned you were, taking some time away. A sabbatical, he called it." She felt a spark of heat in her chest. Arthur was already writing her out of the narrative, spinning her absence as a mental health retreat rather than a confrontation over his theft. "He's always had a flair for fiction, Marcus. I wouldn't miss tonight for the world. It's a milestone for the foundation, isn't it?" The attorney shifted his weight, looking toward Arthur. "Indeed, he's very proud of the new endowment. He's planning to announce the expansion of the Vance wing within the hour." Elena smiled, a thin, sharp expression that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure it will be an announcement no one will ever forget." As Marcus moved on to greet other guests, she felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. The scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch preceded him. She didn't have to turn to know it was her father. "Elena," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble of performative affection. He didn't look at her. His eyes were scanning the room, checking to see who was watching this father-daughter reunion. "I'm glad you decided to be sensible. This is a big night for the family. Don't ruin the optics with that sour expression." "The optics are everything to you, aren't they?" she asked, stepping out from under his hand. He finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "They are the reason you have that dress on your back and food in your stomach. Try to remember that before you open your mouth tonight. I've told everyone you're exhausted from the move. Stick to the script." Before she could respond, Beatrice Vance drifted toward them, her diamonds catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. She looked at Elena's neck, her expression curdling instantly. "Arthur, look at that," Beatrice said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby socialite. She reached out, her manicured fingers hovering near the sapphire. "Elena, really? That necklace is part of the estate's historical collection. It's far too valuable to be worn to a crowded gala. It looks desperate, like you're trying too hard to prove you still belong here." "It belonged to my mother, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "It belongs to me, not the estate, and certainly not you." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking titter. "It belongs to whoever pays the insurance premiums, dear, And right now, that's your father. It's tacky to flaunt what you can't maintain. Why don't you go to the powder room and take it off? I'll have Julian put it in the wall safe for the night. You wouldn't want to lose it while you're being emotional. Arthur nodded in agreement, his face a mask of bored authority. Listen to your mother, Elena. It's a bit much. You're making a scene. The rage spike was sudden and cold. Elena looked around the small circle. Several donors were watching, their faces filled with that peculiar brand of wealthy pity. She saw Julian look away, his jaw tight with shame. I think I'll keep it on, she said, her voice carrying clearly. In fact, I think it's the most honest thing in this room. Everything else here seems to be built on borrowed time and stolen money. Arthur's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He stepped closer, his voice a lethal whisper. You are one word away from being escorted out of this building by security. I have worked too hard for this legacy to let a spiteful girl tarnish it because she's upset about a trust fund she wasn't ready to manage. I'm not upset, Arthur, she said, using his name instead of father for the first time in public. The word felt like a declaration of war. I'm focused. You should enjoy your speech tonight. Really give them the performance of a lifetime. Because once the music stops, the lights are going to be very, very bright. He sneered, his arrogance shielding him from the edge in her tone. You have nothing but empty threats and a vivid imagination. Now go find a corner and stay in it. The board is waiting for me. He turned his back on her, dismissing her as if she were a minor inconvenience. Beatrice gave her a look of pure triumph before following him, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. Elena stood alone for a moment, watching them walk toward the podium at the far end of the hall. She saw Mrs. Gable standing near the tech booth in the shadows, the older woman offering a single, slow nod. The accountant held a tablet in her hand, her fingers poised over the screen. Julian lingered for a second, looking at his sister. Elena, what are you doing? Just let it go for tonight. He's at his most dangerous when he's winning. That's the thing, Julian, she said, her hand closing around the clutch. He thinks he's winning. He thinks the world is exactly what he says it is. She began to walk toward the front of the room, moving with a grace and purpose that drew eyes from across the ballroom. She wasn't hiding in a corner. She took a seat in the very front row, directly in Arthur's line of sight. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, and the room fell into an expectant silence. Arthur Vance stepped up to the podium, the foundation's logo glowing on the massive digital screen behind him. He adjusted his cuffs, flashed a $1 million smile to the crowd, and began to speak about the importance of trust. Elena sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on his. She reached into her bag and felt the cool plastic of the drive. She looked at the screen, then back at her father. Wait for it, she thought, her heart slowing into a calm, predatory rhythm. Wait for the music to stop. Legacy is a promise, Arthur Vance declared, his voice booming through the ballroom's high-fidelity speakers. He looked every bit the king of the city, standing behind the Vance Foundation crest in a tuxedo that cost more than most people earned in a year. A promise that the values we hold today will protect the generations of tomorrow. Elena sat in the front row, the air around her thick with the cloying scent of expensive lilies and the underlying ozone of the massive digital screen behind her father. She didn't blink. Her fingers were closed around the small, cold rectangle of a USB drive inside her clutch. She had already bypassed the security on the media console during the cocktail hour, slipping the drive into the port while the technician was distracted by a staged spill at the bar. All she needed was the right moment. And that is why, Arthur continued, flashing a practiced $1 million smile toward the cameras, we are expanding the trust's reach to ensure. Which trust, Arthur? Elena's voice wasn't loud, but in the expectant hush of the room, it cut through the air like a razor through silk. Arthur froze, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second before the mask of paternal indulgence slid back into place. Elena, dear, we'll have time for questions after the presentation. Please take your seat. I think the board would prefer answers now. She stood up, her movement fluid and calm, drawing every eye in the room. She pressed a small remote hidden in her palm. The screen behind Arthur flickered. The golden logo of the Vance Foundation vanished, replaced by a stark white spreadsheet. It wasn't a marketing slide. It was a forensic audit of the Mercer Vance Trust, detailing 12 years of systematic siphoning. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the low, mechanical hum of the projector. "That's my mother's signature," Elena said, pointing to the screen where a digital copy of a forged document was magnified. "And that's your signature, authorizing the transfer of $3 million into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands on the day of her funeral. While I was at the cemetery, you were at the bank." Arthur's face didn't just pale, it seemed to physically deflate. The confident, bronze hue of his skin curdled into a sickly, translucent gray, making the burst capillaries on his nose stand out like jagged red lightning. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch that he couldn't control. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow mask of primal terror. His eyes darted frantically toward the exits, then back to the glowing screen, his pupils dilating until the blue of his irises nearly vanished. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium so hard his knuckles turned the color of bone, his breath coming in ragged, audible wheezes that the microphone broadcast to the entire horrified room. A sharp crack echoed through the hall. Beatrice Vance had dropped her champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the marble, the expensive vintage soaking into the hem of her designer gown, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, her social mask finally shattered as she realized the lifestyle she had defended was built on a crime that was now public. To her left, Julian Vance stood up slowly. He looked at the ledger, then at his father. The worship in his eyes died in an instant, replaced by a cold, sickening realization. He looked like he wanted to vomit. Marcus Hallowell, the Foundation's legal counsel, leaned forward so far he nearly fell out of his chair. He pulled his spectacles down, his face hardening as he recognized the account numbers and the blatant illegality of the transfers. He didn't look at Arthur with pity. He looked at him like a diseased limb that needed to be amputated to save the body. Near the back, Mrs. Gable sat perfectly still. The elderly accountant's expression was one of somber vindication. She had kept the paper trail alive for a decade, waiting for someone with the courage to follow it. This is a fabrication," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking and thin. He looked at the crowd, searching for a friendly face, but found only a sea of judgment. The very people he had spent decades trying to impress were now pulling away, their bodies leaning back as if his disgrace were contagious. Elena stepped closer to the podium, looking up at the man who had spent her entire life trying to make her feel small. She felt no anger now, only a profound, icy clarity. "You told me I didn't belong in this world, Arthur," she said, her voice carrying to the very back of the ballroom without the need for a microphone. "You said I was a liability to the Vance name. You were right. I'm the liability that just foreclosed on your life. The authorities are waiting in the foyer. I'd suggest you don't keep them waiting." She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't stay to watch the security guards or the inevitable scrambling of the board. She turned her back on the podium and walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for her like a dark tide, their whispers rising behind her like the sound of a collapsing house. She stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Vance legacy behind her. The silence she left behind in the ballroom didn't last long. It was punctured first by a low, rhythmic thrumming of whispers that quickly escalated into a roar of frantic speculation. Elena had barely reached the bottom of the grand marble staircase in the foyer when the heavy oak doors behind her burst open. "Elena, you petulant, lying girl, get back here." Arthur's voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the humid night air. He stumbled onto the portico, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned and his face a terrifying shade of purple. Behind him, Beatrice trailed like a ghost, her hands trembling as she clutched a silk wrap that had cost more than most people earned in a year. Julian was there too, hovering in the shadow of the doorway, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. Elena turned slowly, her heels clicking with a lethal precision against the wet pavement. The scent of damp earth and expensive lilies from the foyer arrangements mingled in the air, a cloying sweetness that made her stomach turn. She didn't speak. She simply waited. "You think a few doctored spreadsheets and a dramatic exit will ruin me?" Arthur sneered, descending the steps toward her. He was sweating now, the fine sheen of perspiration catching the light of the street lamps. "I built this legacy." "I am the Vance name. You are nothing but a disgruntled architect with a grudge." "I'm not the one with the grudge, Arthur," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I'm the one with the receipts." From the shadows of the foyer, a figure stepped forward. Mrs. Gable looked smaller than Elena remembered, wrapped in a sensible wool coat, but her eyes were hard. She held a black leather ledger against her chest like a shield. Beside her stood Marcus Hallowell, the man who had been the Vance family's lead counsel for 2 decades. Arthur stopped mid-stride. "Marcus, what is this? Get this woman out of here. She's senile." Marcus didn't move to help him. Instead, he adjusted his glasses, his expression one of professional detachment. "I've spent the last 3 hours reviewing the documents Mrs. Gable provided, Arthur. The offshore accounts, the diverted trust funds, the forged signatures on the estate tax returns. It's all there. It's been there for years." The mask of the patriarch didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The high, sharp color of Arthur's fury drained away, replaced by a gray, doughy pallor that made him look 20 years older in a single breath. His eyes, usually cold and piercing, became frantic, darting from the podium to the foyer where the dark-suited men waited. His lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to hide by biting down, but the twitch spread to his cheek, pulling his face into a grotesque, lopsided sneer of pure terror. He looked like a man watching his own execution, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked gasps that whistled through his teeth. His hands, once so steady when signing away her future, shook so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. "Marcus, surely we can. We can discuss a settlement," Arthur stammered, his voice cracking. The board will understand a temporary lapse in—" "The board has already voted, Arthur," Marcus interrupted, his tone icy. "They held an emergency session in the library 10 minutes ago. You've been removed as chairman, effective immediately. Your assets have been frozen pending a full forensic audit." Beatrice let out a strangled cry, her knees buckling. She grabbed the stone railing for support, her manicured nails scratching against the granite. "Frozen? Marcus, you can't be serious. We have the gala next week. The deposit for the yacht." "The yacht is gone, Mother," Julian said, stepping forward. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual arrogance. He looked at Elena, and for the first time in her life, she saw shame in his eyes. "It was never ours. It was hers, all of it." Arthur turned on his son, his hand raised as if to strike him, but he froze. 2 men in dark windbreakers with federal insignias stepped out from the shadows of the stone pillars. The sound of their heavy boots on the gravel was the final punctuation mark on the Vance legacy. "Arthur Vance?" the taller officer asked, his voice echoing under the portico. Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked at Elena, his mouth working silently, like a fish gasping for air. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a pathetic, whimpering desperation. "You did this," he finally hissed, though there was no heat left in it. "You destroyed your own family." "No," Elena said, stepping closer until she was only inches away from the man who had tried to bury her. She could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the metallic scent of his fear. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided your greed was worth more than your daughter. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the wreckage." The officers moved in, their movements efficient and practiced. The metallic snick of handcuffs closing around Arthur's wrists was the most satisfying sound Elena had ever heard. It was a small sound, but it carried the weight of 20 years of silence. Beatrice began to wail, a high-pitched, jagged sound that echoed off the limestone walls of the estate. She lunged toward the officers, but Julian caught her, holding her back as she collapsed into a heap of silk and broken pride. Arthur was led toward the waiting black sedan, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He looked small. For the first time in her life, Elena realized he wasn't a giant. He was just a thief who had been standing on a pedestal she had built for him. As the car door slammed shut, the silence returned to the estate, heavier and colder than before. Marcus approached Elena, handing her a single silver key. "The locks have been changed at the firm," he said quietly. "And the penthouse. Everything is in your name now, Elena, just as your mother intended." Elena took the key, its cold metal biting into her palm. She looked up at the house, the lights still blazing in the ballroom where the elite were currently stripping the Vance name from their social registers. She felt no joy, only a profound sense of completion. She turned away from the house, walking toward her own car. She didn't look back at Beatrice's sobbing or Julian's silent vigil. She had given them exactly what they had earned. As she pulled out of the long, winding driveway, the gates of the Vance estate swung shut in her rearview mirror. The reckoning was over, but the silence was just beginning. She drove into the dark, the city lights flickering in the distance, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was driving toward a home that actually belonged to her. 6 months later, the morning air in the city felt crisp, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone that preceded a heavy rain. Elena Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new architectural firm, her reflection ghosting against the glass. She wasn't looking at the skyline. She was watching the steady, rhythmic pulse of the street below. Her office was a masterpiece of light and glass, a far cry from the heavy, suffocating mahogany of her father's former empire. Here, the air was clean, and the only shadows were those cast by the sun. The hum of a high-end espresso machine was the only sound until the heavy glass door clicked open. Marcus Hallowell stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase that looked thinner than it had during the months of litigation. He looked at her with a mixture of professional respect and a touch of something softer, perhaps pity for the war she had been forced to win. "The final filings were processed this morning," he said, setting a single sheet of paper on her desk. "It's over, Elena. The Vance Group has been fully liquidated. The creditors are satisfied, and the remaining assets from your mother's trust have been fully restored to your private accounts." She didn't pick up the paper. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of it from across the room. And the others. Marcus sighed, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Beatrice Vance is living in a 2-bedroom garden apartment in the suburbs. I'm told she spends most of her time writing letters to social committees that no longer return her calls. She's tried to sell her remaining jewelry, but most of it turned out to be high-quality glass. Arthur had swapped the stones years ago to cover his margins." Elena felt a sharp, cold pang of irony. Beatrice had spent 30 years worshipping at the altar of a man who had been selling her crown jewels behind her back. "And Julian? He's working," Marcus said, sounding surprised. "He's a junior site manager for a residential firm in Jersey. He's living in a studio. Mrs. Gable tells me he calls her once a week to ask for recipes. He's the only one who hasn't tried to file a countersuit against you." "He was always the best of us," she whispered, her gaze drifting back to the window. "Which isn't saying much." "There is one more thing," Marcus added, his voice dropping an octave. "Your father. The sentencing for the embezzlement charges is next week. He's currently at a halfway house while he awaits the final hearing. He's been asking to see you." The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by the distant siren of an ambulance. Elena didn't answer immediately. She picked up a silver fountain pen from her desk, a gift from the board of the new community center she'd designed. It was cold and heavy in her hand. 2 hours later, she found herself in a part of the city she had never visited. The streets were gray, the air smelling of damp concrete and cheap grease. She found Arthur Vance sitting on a peeling wooden bench in a small, fenced-in park. The wounded wolf looked less like a predator and more like a ghost. He was wearing a wool coat that was 2 sizes too large, his once-manicured hands tucked into his pockets to hide their trembling. When he looked up, his eyes didn't have the fire she remembered. They were watery and pale. "Elena," he rasped. He started to stand, but his knees seemed to fail him halfway, and he sank back onto the bench. "Marcus said you had something to say," she said. She stayed 10 feet away, her heels clicking once on the pavement before she went still. "I did it for the family," he said, the old lie falling from his lips with practiced ease. "The business was failing. I couldn't let the Vance name become a joke. I thought if I used your trust, I could bridge the gap, then put it back before you ever knew. I was protecting your future." "You weren't protecting me, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of the rage that had fueled her for months. Now there was only a profound, echoing hollowness. "You were protecting your ego. You stole from your daughter to buy a legacy that was built on sand." He looked down at his shoes, cheap, rubber-soled things that made no sound when he shuffled them. "I have nothing left. They took the watch. They took the cars. I'm an old man with a bus pass and a court date." He looked at her then, a flicker of the old entitlement returning to his gaze. "You have the penthouse, you have the firm, surely a small allowance for your father, just until I get back on my feet." Elena looked at the man who had raised her. She saw the desperation, the greed that refused to die even in the face of total ruin. She reached into her bag, and for a moment, hope flared in his eyes. She pulled out a small, framed photograph she had taken from the estate. It was a picture of her mother, young and laughing, before the Vance name had begun to wear her down. She walked forward and placed the photo on the bench beside him. "This is all you're getting from me," she said. "A reminder of what you actually lost while you were busy counting the money." She turned and walked away. Behind her, she heard him call her name, his voice cracking, but she didn't look back. She walked toward her car, the rain finally beginning to fall in large, heavy drops that splashed against the hot pavement. That night, she sat in the living room of the penthouse. It was a beautiful space, filled with the finest art and the softest silks. But as the city lights flickered outside, the silence of the massive apartment felt absolute. She had won. The name was hers, the money was hers, and the justice was served. But as she looked at the empty chairs and the silent hallways, she realized the true cost of her victory. She had burned down the house to save the foundation, and now she was the only one left to live in the ruins. She picked up her glass, the wine tasting of ash, and toasted the empty room. The reckoning was over, and the silence was her only inheritance.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.